Wonderful. So now we'll have a discussion with all of our speakers. I've prepared a few questions that I'd be interested in discussing, but before I bring those up, I just wanted to give everyone a chance to respond to each other in each other's presentations, if anything that you wanted to say or ask. Yeah. So, please.
I have a lot of comments, but questions we should get from the audience.
Okay, so I'll make one observation. I thought it was amazingly clear that there was a real coherence across the three talks in the kind of the underlying purpose of education and the role of experience as the person subjectively experiences it. So not just what happens to you, but how that changes who you are as changing the person who you are going forward. And we hit that at very different levels, but all three of us were really touching on that same kind of trajectory of a human being, which I think is actually not the usual way that education is talked about.
Similarly, this notion of individual differences and individual variation, it's quite striking hearing you talk about it from a philosopher's perspective. Since I think you're right that many neuroscientists really value looking at individual variation as opposed to group average differences.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was also struck by that commonality. Well, in that case, I guess I have a few questions that, I mean, in preparing for this seminar, I was reading some of the critiques of neuroscience in education, and I'm curious how you would respond to these. I just read an article by Jeffrey Bowers. I don't know if you came across this, March 2016. He was criticizing educational neuroscience, suggesting that behavioral methods and assessments of cognitive abilities are really how we assess whether someone is learning or being educated or something like that. And I wonder if you agree that behavioral measures are the true test of the effectiveness of educational methods. And maybe more directly, then what is the true test of the effectiveness of education? And how does neuroscience connect with that?
I'm happy to take this one first. So I think that's right, of course, that ultimately what we care about are cognitive behavioral differences. If an intervention only affects the brain and has no measurable effect on cognition, I'm not sure there would be much value there. However, I don't think that dismisses the role of neuroscience in assessing the effectiveness of interventions. So there's quite a bit of work in plasticity, for example, that would suggest that often we can detect brain changes before we can detect behavioral changes. So one could imagine, and in some cases this has actually been shown, that we can use neuroscience techniques to sort of monitor effectiveness of an intervention before we might see measurable or meaningful cognitive or behavioral differences. And the other instance where I think it can be quite valuable is that sometimes we see similar behavioral or cognitive phenotypes with different underlying neurobiological profiles. And so it's possible that neurobiological profile may predict response to intervention in a way that cognitive profile wouldn't at the outset.
Maybe I could say briefly that the phrase behavioral measures makes me think of, I think it was Shakespeare who asked the question, how do you take the measure of a man? How do you take the measure of a person? And I think what's interesting is the sort of holistic conceptions of assessment that have been and are still being developed in our schools, really trying to look at the whole person, I think in the way that especially Mary Ellen was talking about, trying to see and listen to a child or an adolescent talk about their relation with the world, their relation with other people, their relation with themselves. So I think we need to look beyond behavioral measures, depending on how we gloss the term behavior. We need to really take seriously the inner life of the student, give that student a voice, if you will, a participation in the assessment of that student himself.
Great. One idea that I wanted to bring up, I was quite struck by this, in Professor Immordino-Yang's work about differences between cultures of how the people use their brains to evaluate emotional experiences, actually using different parts of their brains. And I wondered how this bears on Professor Hansen's notion of cosmopolitanism, with the question of if we're using our brains in different ways to understand emotions, does that somehow constrict or limit what we can understand about what each other is thinking if we're using different neurophysiology? Does that touch on this issue, and how does that relate?
Should I explain the cultural findings in 30 seconds, seeing as you know them, but I didn't talk about them? So just briefly, what we basically find so far as we've run these kinds of experiments in different cultural contexts, for example, is that we don't see differences in the level of brain activation as people are experiencing emotions. And we don't see differences in the kinds of emotions people say that they're experiencing, because we've very carefully designed the stories and the stimuli so that they invoke the kind of emotion we're interested in. Because if we just saw people not reacting because it's not a story that really has potency in their cultural context, that would be a different kind of study. So I want you to understand that we carefully design stories that are true stories, based on true stories, that people in all the different cultural groups we've studied can equally appreciate, are compassion-inducing, or are virtue, admiration for virtue-inducing. What we find is that people are explaining the same kinds of emotion states, and they are having the same kind of brain activity. They're having somewhat different psychophysiological activity, which gives you a clue. But where the really striking difference is in the correspondence between brain and behavioral activity in time, trial by trial, as they're telling us how they feel. The way in which people come to be aware of what they're experiencing at that moment seems to be shaped by culture. So in other words, when we look at how the brain and bodily activity are tracking with a person's reports of their experience fluctuating over time over the course of an hour in the scanner, that's where we see really striking cultural differences. And those cultural differences we're now beginning to tie to experiences in the home. So for example, in bicultural kids who are immigrants into Los Angeles, we see that the quality of their parental relationships and acculturation at home is actually predicting the extent to which they take on these cultural patterns. So we think they're learned. That's the basic finding, yeah.
And just briefly, cosmopolitanism, which I've done a fair amount of work on, it's a very old word, as you know. It comes from the Greek cosmopolites, person of the world, citizen of the world. It's been of keen interest to a lot of people in education and elsewhere because of the increasing globalization, diversification of our world, and the fact that people are just being often thrown together. And in a nutshell, cosmopolitanism, as I think of it, it's an orientation towards one's life experience as a human being that is an educational orientation. Put differently, cosmopolitanism as a word or as a term captures the idea of how do we learn as human beings to be, on the one hand, reflectively open to new persons, new values, new practices, new ideas, but also reflectively loyal and committed to who we are, to our upbringing, to our identities, our cultural heritages, and the like. It's a very dynamic linkage, and if I can use a term we just heard, it really takes time to cultivate that. And we have to think, I think, of school as K through 12. In terms of really cultivating orientations like this, to deal with cultural difference and similarity and the like.
I'll just ask one more question before we open for the audience to ask questions, and this is for the neuroscientists here. And I wonder, to what extent do the moral and ethical dimensions of education directly inform your work, if at all? I mean, does it come up in any explicit way that you would say? And is this part of your conception and definition of education when you're doing your work?
Do you understand?
Sure. The moral and ethical.
Moral and ethical. I mean, that this seems to be in distinguishing education from learning and development.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you speak into the microphone?
Sure. So it does in a number of ways. Sort of broad reach. So one thing is how to approach this question. Okay. So one thing is working with disadvantaged populations. It's we have to be very sensitive to how we approach schools or families, coming from an Ivy League institution, a lab, an entity of higher learning, and sort of making it clear that we're not trying to differentiate us versus them in a sensitive way. And so it's sort of a very basic issue, sort of a human subject's ethical question. Also, when dealing with interventions and providing interventions, there's often a question of what are we doing for a control group, right? So is it fair to provide an intervention to one group and not to another group? And so, when we're talking about similar situations with drug trials, for example, the rationale is that, well, we don't know if the drug is better than placebo or whatever the standard is. So, it is an ethical question. When you're talking about providing an educational intervention, if you're fairly confident that the educational intervention is going to be effective, then is that fair? So often we, do things like providing the control group with similar services after the conclusion of the study. So it's just sort of a time lag as opposed to actually providing less services.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Andrew. And building on what Dr. Noble said, so I think the question of ethics and of how people are going to use the work is hugely present for me, and also when I'm interpreting the neuroscience research for teachers. I also spend a lot of time in schools and talking to teachers. I mean, I think there's always an implicit assumption that better scores on the kinds of tests that are related to school outcomes mean that the person is doing better. And there's a lot of tension around those kinds of assumptions in the cultural world. Why is it better, for example, that a kid has executive capacities that are really good? It's better because it helps you do better in the kinds of outcomes that we have designed for you, but maybe it's not better a person, right, as a person. So there's a huge amount of value-driven cultural bias that's going into the realm of education to start with. People like Barbara Rogoff have really talked about this a lot. How Hispanic kids learn by watching and by learning from each other, you know, like Mayan kids, as compared to being taught directly. And they're used to learning that way. And it's a different kind of learning, and it doesn't get assessed in the way that we assess kids. Okay, so that's one sort of outcome. And so as we're doing research as scientists, I find we're informing the debate, we're supporting the teacher in the way that we heard it from the final speaker, in making decisions about what they're doing. And really, I would say, in understanding the implications of what they're doing. And in doing that, I strive as much as possible, though I'm always trying to work on it, to be as transparent as possible about what my implicit values are. I do think it's better to be a more reflective person who can make perspectives that are explicit about who they are and about what they intend for themselves. And that's my cultural orientation. That's a relatively Western cultural orientation, and it's a relatively culturally specific and temporally specific cultural orientation. So I think by laying that on the table, you help people to become aware of it and to evaluate it for themselves, which is kind of the fair way to put information out there. But it's a constant struggle. Yeah, it's a constant struggle.
So with that, I think we can open for the questions to the audience. So if anyone has any questions, then you can ask them now. So please. If you could please also stand up, and because it's difficult to hear in this room, and speak out. Thank you.
So my name is Kavita Sivaramakrishnan. I'm a historian of global health, and I work on aging. So my questions are really coming kind of to insert global health and history into this. So my first observation was to Professor Noble, which is when you do cash transfer programs, it's very important to look at the structure of the family, and intergenerational families, as in older people in the family, makes a huge difference. Have you considered that when you look at Esther Duflo's study, for instance, the development economist? She looks at how cash transfers in South Africa, if you give mothers to grandmothers, grandmothers make a difference to granddaughters. So what is the idea of, it makes a difference both gender as well as intergenerationality? And my second question is really about, as a historian, I think timing really is important in terms of what generation people are part of, in terms of feeling compassion or emotion. The generation that was born in China in the 1980s with the one-child family has a very different value in terms of both understanding motherhood and filial piety. So how does that make a difference when you try to understand this, as opposed to understanding another generation that's born before or after?
So on the cash transfer question, so we are taking careful measurements of family structure at each point in time that we'll be doing data collection. We're providing the cash transfers to the mother in part because of logistical reasons. We'll be recruiting the mothers in the hospital at the time they give birth. So we'll be taking assessments, or asking the moms how they're dispersing the money among family members or whatnot, if they are, and how it's affecting other cash in and out of the family. But sort of by nature of the design of the study, we are giving the cash to the mothers. And sorry, when was your second question?
The second question, I think, might have been to me. Looking at how, I'll reframe your question in a broad way, looking at how people from different kinds of experiences and different kinds of cultural orientations, because by virtue of the kind of upbringing they've had, is shaping the way in which they make meaning. So, for example, children born in China during the one-child policy have a different set of values around family and around parenting. So that's, in essence, exactly what we're trying to study, is how the ways in which people are exposed exposed to certain kinds of norms and values around them is shaping their ability to have values. So we're not judging the quality of the values and saying, like, you should have this kind of value versus that kind of value. Instead, we're trying to study the developmental process by which people come to have values as something that's socially and culturally supported. Does that make sense? So we're not judging the specific of the content of the value. We're trying to understand how it is we support people in coming to have self-oriented, culturally situated values that are instrumental for them, so that we can support them in making meaning that's adaptive to them. Yeah.
Can I just follow up on that, your answer to that question? And that is to ask, how do you measure experiences? I mean, what are they? What kind of categories?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's kind of a confusing word. There just is not a good word in the English language for this. When I say I'm studying experiences, there's two levels to the experience, right? So, and in the same panel, we've had it both ways, which is even more confusing. So I think when Dr. Noble's studying experience, she means the things a kid has lived through, right? The kinds of circumstances that they have been in. When I study experience, I mean that, but I also mean the way in which a person comes to be consciously aware of their emotional state at the moment. So the way in which you construct a conscious experience or an awareness of something right now. And the brain and physiological processes and cognitive processes that go into constructing that conscious awareness in the moment.
So it really is a very short...
This is a short-lived thing,
right,
yes.
Yeah, and the longer term, how do you...
Right, so that's exactly it. So we're following kids, right now we're following kids longitudinally across time. So we kind of, the big picture, we started with across the lifespan, right? Just sort of people from a range so that we could look at the underlying neural and psychophysiological signatures of these and the cognitive signatures of these emotions. And then we began to look more at individual variation across adults and then cultural variation across adults. So now we can get a sense of how culture is shaping or informing the variation and the ways in which things are varying over time, so that we can then step back and start to look at individual variation within groups and how that's related to the way in which a person makes meaning out of the stuff that's happened to them, right? So we're asking kids now, you know, what kind of violence they've witnessed in their communities, right? And these kids have all seen stuff. And then, you know, that's one thing, like how many murders have you seen, right? But then what's even more important and of interest to us is how do you talk about that? Why do you, so if we ask questions like, why do you think that person did that? What kind of answers are they able to give us? There's no right answer, there's no wrong answer, but there are more reflective, more realistic, more considerative answers that are taking into account more different ways of knowing, more different perspectives, more factors and ways that are integrated together. That's what we're looking for. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Hi. I just want to thank you for talking about this topic. I'm a master's degree candidate in the Neuroscience and programs, and this is really wonderful. But one thing that I'm noticing over time, and you touched on this as your first question, is that there is still some discrimination about this being an interdisciplinary field. And I guess this is more of an ask for advice than it is a question, where I'd love to hear your thoughts on how young people or people who want to continue to move forward and make this into a truly interdisciplinary field, how we should view it. And how to sort of mitigate from the harsh criticism that you received in some other circles to leave neuroscience and education as these, you know, siloed fields because of historical precedent. I know it's tough, I'm sorry.
Do you want me to take a step? So then you can start after that. The way I think about it is that, you know, I come from a perspective that we call mind, brain, and education. And the reason I do that is because I have an orientation as a human development psychologist toward trying to understand a whole person growing in context. And so I was trained in my doctoral program as a human development psychologist and then studied affective and social neuroscience, and I'm trying to bring them together. And the reason why I think neuroscience goes together with what I'm studying and why you know, the next generation of teachers should be familiar with what we're learning from it is because it's another source of information that we have now in the modern study of child development to be able to understand and sort of take the lid off of what's going on underneath the development of cognition and emotion and relationships in kids, how kids are growing over time. And so I think it's a mistake to shut out a source of evidence. It's also a mistake, like we heard from the talks, to completely abandon the wisdom of practice, as it was called, in order to just wholeheartedly adopt evidence that was from a very different context, right? So these are different sources of evidence on the very complex, difficult problem of how people grow and learn. And we need to sort of pull together every source of information we have to be able to integrate those to understand how people learn in order to support it. But one level of evidence can't replace the other directly.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. You know, neuroscientists or even some psychologists often scoff at the field of education for not being evidence-based, right? And it's very challenging to truly implement randomized trials in ways that would sort of pass muster from more traditional scientists in the classroom setting, right? Do you randomize at the level of the child or at the level of the classroom, in which case you've got some inherent biases there. So it's very complicated to do, but I think it would really be quite a shame, as Mary Helen said, to sort of eliminate an entire field's worth of knowledge from the setting that may in fact provide information or benefit the field of education in a way that can really benefit children. So I think that the struggle is real and is there, but it's worth trying to meet the challenge and, you know, on a practical level, designing studies that pass muster from both sides. I think you can be both rigorous and not so myopic that you're ignoring the realities of the classroom.
Just very briefly, there is a sort of a sociology of knowledge involved in here, where each discipline takes on its own identity, its own concerns, its own internal values, et cetera, and it can often be there's lots of reasons why people are almost defensive sometimes about their disciplines, as I think you gestured towards. But you know, I think this panel represents that a whole other way of thinking of research is shared concerns, shared questions, shared interests, which can, you know, very organically bring people together. And I would invite you to explore that conjunction "and" a lot. It's a very rich word.
If I might just follow up on that question, maybe just to press a bit more, one of the criticisms and the frictions that I think that comes in evaluating the neuroscience of education is in looking at specific policy changes that would happen in a classroom. And of course, you know, it's better to know more, and there may be unforeseen connections, and it's difficult to argue that we shouldn't have a neuroscientific understanding. But where does it, I mean, how would you respond to that criticism? I mean, what kinds of specific classroom interventions can promote these kinds of, that can apply this kind of knowledge, maybe, to say? I don't know if that gets partially at what you were getting at, but I see that as a related. Okay. Okay. Yes, please.
I'm a teacher educator, and I use this information in my courses. I brought my students with me to this presentation for just this reason, to narrow the gap in the conversation. I think that teacher educators and educators have bodies of knowledge that are valuable and useful to inform the lessons being learned from cognitive neuroscience. And I think one of the things that I often wonder about is where are the avenues for us not to really tell one another, you know, what to do and how to do it, but really, how do we partner and join together and partner in conducting research and really speaking and sharing our expertise across that boundary? Because as I'm listening to your presentations, I'm thinking about the immediate implications for what it is that you all are finding and how that can translate and inform my students' practices. And so really also shrinking that gap. But I would love to begin to open up a conversation in a context where there's space for those of us who, and I'm a progressive educator too, and so there is a way in which cognitive neuroscience finally gives hard science permission to honor the individuality of every single child in a way that we haven't had before. that it gives an anchor and a foundation for the importance of play, for the importance of conversation, for interaction, and eliciting children's conversations. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on ways in which to partner across the boundary so that both of our work is strengthened and much more tailored to what exists in transforming.
Can I respond very briefly? I think in a way your question, or some of the questions, are what Andrew asked earlier about the ethical and moral dimensions that connect science and education. Because in a way you're talking about what's the constitution of our relationship, our human-to-human relationship in these different fields. And it's very hard, in my experience, to bring people together. The project I described with 16 teachers from 8 different schools, it was a huge logistical thing to bring people together. It's very rare for teachers in schools, just as it is for people in different academic disciplines. But the key element was time. And I got external funding to actually pay the teachers a small stipend just to make it worthwhile. It's temporal. You cannot rush this kind of relationship. And so I think, Kimberly, one of your potential policy outcomes was a kind of a normative conclusion. Where are we spending our resources in society? I think we might want to think here at Columbia, Teachers College, where are we spending our resources? Should it be just in our silos? What about more connections like this very program that Andrew and colleagues have done? But it's very time intensive, and we have to give it all the time it takes. I think it just can't be rushed. We need a good infrastructure.
I think we have time for one more question.
Can I make one really quick comment before? So this isn't answering your question, but sort of pushing it forward to say that the International Mind, Brain, and Education Society is an interdisciplinary organization that specifically supports these conversations between teachers and researchers and scientists and cognitive scientists and philosophers. And we have our biannual conference coming up in September in Toronto. You can find us at imbes.org for people who are interested.
If there's any other questions, maybe just one more. Yes, please.
Yeah. I'm not a neurobiologist, but when I was younger, I was a microbiologist in hard science. When you spoke, you never used the word empathy. And you used the word inference or infer constantly. And every time you said that word, I always translated it into my mind as empathy.
The reason, that's a great question. Yeah. The reason I use the word inference or compassion instead of empathy is because empathy is conceived as something relatively automatic, where you are sort of internalizing the state of another person directly. And I think that's really only a very, very tiny piece of what's actually going on in our studies. We're looking at how people conceptualize, how people make meaning about things, which is a heavily cognitively supported process. And so I use a word like infer, which suggests the cognitive effort that goes into that kind of mind state.
For me, an inference is an intellectual guess, an educated guess, where empathy is something felt.
See, I don't honor that division between cognition and emotion. I think they actually are closer.
Empathy is not automatic. It requires reflection.
Yeah.
And one just quick.
Sure, just one final point, and then I think
when Einstein was born, this has to do with whether you're born a genius or you become a genius. I don't know this, but when Einstein was, when he died and they took his brain and looked at it, at all these connections, cognitive and everything, when he was born, did he have any extra?
We don't know. We don't know.
Party ever met.
But I suspect he didn't. And I think that's so encouraging because that allows anybody to become that intelligent and bright and genius rather than say, well, he was born that way.
So I think that there are likely individual differences in potential as well, right? So I don't think it's likely the case that all of us could go to Harvard if just put in the perfect circumstance to do so. I think that's probably not true. However, I think there are also tremendous inequalities of experience that we as a society can decide to put our resources into rectifying so that a child can live up to his or her genetic or innate or whatever you want to call it potential.
Great. Okay, so I would invite you all to join us for the reception where we can ask more questions and continue this discussion. May I just thank one more time all of our speakers for speaking.